The Adventures of the All Guardsman Party, Chapter 4, What's in the Box, Part 2. Twitch wasn't the most stable person at the best of times, but he was far worse around orcs. It was an orc commando's raid which had initially triggered his paranoia, so being this near an entire army of them made Twitch incredibly, twitchy. He was initially sent to interview a few soldiers who had used the mysterious guns. Unfortunately, each session devolved into him questioning everyone in sight about the last orc sighting, the quality of the perimeter defenses, and whether anyone else had seen the barrel over there move. Twitch's only contribution to our investigation was repeatedly insisting that this was all the orcs' fault. We eventually gave up on him and let him secure the base after a particularly memorable formal dinner. In a short period of time, he had accused several officers of acting orky, decked a clerk who tapped him on his shoulder, and accused the troopers who restrained him of being cleverly disguised orcs. In some ways, Nubby was even worse. While Twitch wildly accused people and random objects of being orcs in disguise, Nubby was actually mistaken for a Gretchen on 3 separate occasions. The first 2 were embarrassing for everyone involved, but guards are meant to be suspicious and no one was actually hurt. The third time was much worse. Nubby was supposed to be attending a demonstration of one of the mysterious guns along with one of the tech priests. The demonstration was held in an AdMech warehouse. Nubby, being Nubby, he immediately dumped the job onto the tech priest and wandered off to see what was in stock. He was found by a pair of servo skulls as he pillaged fancy-looking data slates out of several inadequately secured storage lockers. A short firefight ensued, which attracted a nearby engineer, who in turn misidentified Nubby as a Gretchen looter and called for reinforcements. By the time word got to Sarge, several more servo skulls were destroyed. Nubby was hiding behind a crate of plasma weapons, and a guard patrol was arguing with the engineer about whether a Gretchen could actually detonate a plasma weapon. Sarge sorted everything out, and a suspiciously bulky-looking Nubby was escorted out of the building in exchange for a promise that he never return. Between the interviews and the demos, we got a pretty good look at all of the weapons and their effects. The tech priest said that there wasn't anything sinister about their function. They were just very well made and never seemed to jam or misfire. There was a lot of fancy words about alloys and mechanisms and shit too, but that really didn't concern us. All we knew was that the autoguns hit about as hard as a boulder, the recoil was just hard enough to know that the gun worked, and both their report and action sounded awesome. Cutter expressed similar sentiments about his new chainsword, along with dire threats against anyone who tried to take it away from him. He did the same thing if you tried to take away his food, though, so we were pretty sure there wasn't anything sinister. The incredible awesomeness of these weapons was suspicious, but Doc was positive that they weren't mutating anyone. Just to be sure, we had the Adepts and Alfred, who we were pretty sure was psychic, see if they could detect anything spooky about the gear. None of them detected any warp stuff around their weapons or armor, though Alfred said that they were definitely a little weird. We had almost all the information we needed now. We knew that the weapons were suspiciously awesome, and the soldiers used them because they were awesome. We knew that none of the troopers were turning into demons or mutating, and that the weapons were doing anything warpy, and Twitch knew that everyone was secretly an orc. The only information that was still missing was the source of the gear, and as it turned out, the last piece of intel was in Nubby's pants. During his little escapade in the Mechanicus warehouse, Nubby had crammed his packs, pockets, sleeves, and pants with expensive-looking knickknacks, parts, tools, and data slates. It was standard procedure to hold Nubby upside down and shake him after one of his adventures, mostly to see if he had gotten his hands on anything important, but also because we had a running bet on how much he'd take. One of several data slates he had shoved down his pants contained information about a crazier than usual Magos that had built a portable weapons factory. The factory had provided millions of weapons and tons of ammo to the local PDF, but had stopped working a few years after the Magos died to technobonitis or something. Eventually, the weapons were replaced with more standard gear, but the factory was studied by generations of tech priests hoping to get it working again. Right up until an orc wog rolled over the planet. We brought this info to the Rupert, who immediately recalled tales of an unusually well-armed group of greenskins that had been wiped out recently, as well as the name of the regiment which led the final attack. This just so happened to be the same regiment which was spearheading the current attack. A few transports were requisitioned, and our little force headed out into the thick of things to have a chat with the regiment. Of course, within minutes of our departure, convoys from the Commissariat and the Adeptus Mechanicus rolled out as well. Not suspicious at all. The regiment in question was currently so far forward that you had to cross through orc-controlled territory to reach them. The only reason they weren't considered to be cut off and surrounded was the fact that they were kicking so much ass that their boots had started to smell like orc butt. None of us were keen on crossing the gap between the main lines and the regiment, except for the Rupert, who was happily standing on the top hatch and waving his sword around. We were paragons of bravery when compared to the adepts and tech priests, though. They didn't see the attraction of driving through a burned-out city filled with orcs. The second we left Imperial lines, our vehicles started taking small arms fire. Our interrogator cheerily blasted away with the pintle-mounted gun, while we kept our heads down and the non-combatants pissed themselves in terror. All in all, the drive was pretty pleasant, though. Nothing heavy enough to pierce the armor was fired at us, the drivers dodged all the landmines, and none of the orcs were good enough shots to hit the Rupert. Unfortunately, it came to an end at a crude barricade a few blocks short of the regiment's position. Now, a sane man would have just driven back a bit and tried a different street. But not our Rupert. With a tally-ho, he hopped off the top hatch and charged the barricade. We all stared at him for a few seconds as he calmly climbed the barricade, completely ignoring the shots landing all around him. We were considering the merits of just leaving him out there when Cutter revved his chainsword and charged after him with Alfred close on his heels. No one could call what followed a heroic charge. It had more in common with a comedy sketch than a valiant assault on enemy lines. Your typical heroic charge doesn't have two adepts screaming like little girls, or a pair of tech priests bitching about illogical behavior, or a bunch of guardsmen trying to keep the nerds down below the covering fire from our drivers. Also, most charges are supposed to be against something more fearsome than a bunch of Gretchen with handguns. But we weren't complaining. Of course, none of that bothered the Rupert. He and Cuddy gleefully ran to the top of the barricade and started wreaking havoc with swords and pistols, while Alfred did his best to keep them from getting shot in the back. Eventually, the rest of us caught up with the idiots. The Gretchens routed, the drivers headed back to the main lines, and the Rupert led us on an invigorating stroll through the city. We followed the sound of autogun fire to the regiment's perimeter, where we found the way blocked by a bunch of full-sized orcs who were busy dodging Gretchen out of cover and watching them pop. Cutter found this utterly hilarious. Thinking quickly, Sarge had Alfred distract our interrogator with a flask of tea while we formed a plan. Twitch would lead with some grenades, Sarge would flank left, Nubby and Doc would lay down covering fire, and Cutter would run straight in, screaming before any of us got into position. Cutter's sudden charge caught us all off guard. It is a widely known fact that no guardsman has any business being closer to an orc than the maximum range of their last gun. Orcs are bigger, stronger, and tougher than almost any soldier, and they usually have a bunch of buddies nearby. Despite all this, the bloody psychopath was rushing straight into melee range of a whole squad of boys. We did our best to lay down covering fire and watched in surprise as, instead of dying messily, Cutter began taking the greenskins apart. His new sword wrecked their choppers, and his berserk fury surprised the hell out of the orcs. Limbs were flying, blood was everywhere, Gretchen were screaming, and not a single orc noticed that we were mowing them down while they were busy. But it wasn't enough. The orcs began to overwhelm Cutter, and we were sure that our melee specialist was going to be squig food. Then, with a scream that perfectly matched Cutter's, another group of guardsmen rushed into the orcs from behind. The fight was over in seconds, and we all moved forward to greet the troopers who had saved Cutter. As we approached, we noticed that each of them had a shiny new autogun, chainsword, and a set of body armor. We found the regiment. The walk to the regiment's HQ was a little awkward. The troopers who escorted us were the biggest, ugliest, smelliest soldiers we had seen outside the Ogren auxiliaries, and their accents were the worst we'd ever heard. Now, every world has its own variation of Low Gothic, and several older regiments even have their own battle languages. So it wasn't unheard of for guardsmen from different regiments to have trouble talking to each other, but this was just ridiculous. It sounded like Low Gothic, with half the letters missing, a lot of shouting, and a bit of hitting, and a ridiculous amount of slang. We couldn't understand half of what they said, and they didn't even try to understand us. It was lucky that Cutter picked up their language somewhere and was able to act as a translator. With Cutter's help, we managed to convey that the interrogator wanted to talk to their commander. That two friendly convoys would be arriving shortly, and that we wanted to know where their guns came from. To our surprise, this was accepted without fuss. There weren't any pointed questions or evasions or violent reactions. The Rupert, Cutter, and Alfred went to talk to the regiment commander, while the rest of us were taken to see what the troopers called the box. The box was a huge pile of pipes, gears, screens, and other techie stuff, all crammed into a cube the size of a normal hab, which sat on a large flatbed in a warehouse. It had a big hopper on one end and a few conveyor belts coming out of the other. As we watched, a huge mass of scrap metal was dumped into the hopper by some of the troopers. A little while later, a few of the new weapons rolled out onto the belt and were collected by the troopers. The tech priests were freaking out and yelling at each other in binary. We took this as a positive indication of the box as the Magos' gun factory. We sat around and watched the box for a bit while the adepts and tech priests did their thing. Sergeant Doc speculated about the value of the box and whether the odd behavior of the troopers was something sinister or not. To a man, they were bigger and meaner looking than most guardsmen. The regiment was much farther forward than any sane guardsman would put, and they all seemed to be happy. Guardsmen are not supposed to be happy. Sarge was betting on some sort of demon living inside the box. Doc thought there might be some sort of heretical archaeotech in there. Nubby didn't care, and Twitch had made his own theory. Twitch's paranoia had apparently gotten the better of him. He was interrupting every conversation to tell us that the troopers were orcs, that the box was full of orcs, and the orcs outside were double orcs. Eventually, we sent him to go secure us a base. The nerds said they couldn't concentrate with all of his shouting.